thank you all. That was extraordinarily kind and wholly undeserved. And I think gave a really excellent précis of the research projects that I'm doing and will continue to do. So thank you very much. I'm going to time myself because I intend on speaking for about 45 minutes to leave a lot of time for question and answer. Gosh, where is my brain today? All right. So I've got two caveats before I begin. The first is that I'm a historian of Southeast Asia, and the classic area studies mold, comparative knowledge of the region, and the deeply interdisciplinary methods of our field structures my analysis. That's the first caveat. The second caveat is that I am not an anthropologist. So while I speak of the history of anthropology and while I engage with debates in anthropology both historically and contemporarily, I claim no expertise in anthropology. The main reason for this is that about a decade and change ago, I attempted to do participant observation fieldwork, and that demonstrated to me quite starkly and quite clearly that I was not cut out for fieldwork. But here I am talking about the history of fieldwork, some slur about those who cannot teach, right? Those who cannot do teach, so those who cannot do fieldwork write about fieldwork. And so here we are. The encounter in the field between the anthropologist and his others is one of the first moments in the process of ethnographic knowledge production. The attempt to render the native's point of view has been and remains one of the primary motivations of anthropological fieldwork. This encounter, a process of becoming that is both mutual and fraught, was a threshold whose crossing produced both the anthropologist and the native. The field upon which they encounter each other is the same imagined locus of the anthropologist's rite of passage in the Van Gennep sense. It is in the process of its crossing that one becomes an anthropologist. It is also upon this field that natives are made. So my book shifts the frame of Malinowski's field-defining dictum, my anthropologists are my natives, and theirs is the point of view I seek to grasp. I study here what concerns him most directly, most intimately, that is his professional commitments, his identity as an individual and as a scientist in the field, his understanding of his life and his relationships that he has formed. And it's a he, for now, still, although I will be talking about a strange woman, but in this reframing of Malinowski, it is a he that I'm talking about. So he is my savage, the anthropologist is my savage, striving to satisfy certain aspirations, which are neither opaque nor incomprehensible to us, for they too run the breadth of the human experience. We shall see him, my anthropologist, led to perilous and difficult enterprises, which was the ethnographic field in the Philippines, whose dangers were sometimes truly fatal. He, the anthropologist, is led there by a tradition of magical and heroical exploits into which his work and his life would likewise be woven, which is perhaps truly the romance of the field. And from these disparate, disjointed, disorienting experiences, my native, who is my anthropologist, reforms and reconstructs the world which he has encountered into image and text. My reframing shifts this idea of the native's point of view that Malinowski propounded, that mythic charter that functioned to sustain the ethnographic enterprise, to consider that other. That is, the anthropologist as native, whose culture was the discipline of anthropology itself. I argue that what was produced through this encounter was not merely ethnographic knowledge, but more importantly, I argue that it produced the anthropologist himself as a modern gendered subject. I analyze a series of brief, though consequential encounters during the first decade of American colonial rule in the Philippine Islands. These moments emerged from the acquisition of the archipelago in 1898 as part of the spoils of the imperial war against Spain until 1911, with the conclusion of the first anthropological research expedition sent to the Philippines by the Field Museum of Natural History of Chicago. It was precisely the period between the War of 1898 and the First World War that was, according to the anthropologist Joan Vincent, critically formative within the discipline at large, with anthropology and anthropologists working on the cutting edge of American imperialism. And yet it is precisely this period that is absent in the normative histories of the discipline in the United States. The American Empire in the Philippines was not merely context, but cause, and in part likewise, the beneficiary of this knowledge complex that sought to make known the islands and their peoples. I analyzed this complex of knowledge production brought about by ethnographic fieldwork in the same vein as the historian James Hevia thinks of the photography complex. That is, as a series of encounters whose product, the ethnography in my case, the photograph in Hevia's, was a medium that obscures the conditions of its own creation, the technologies that allowed for its construction, the image, both textual and photographic, that signaled the event of its making. This ethnographic knowledge complex, I argue, required the epistemic foundations of ethnological theory, the attempts to carve into science anthropology as the specific science of man, the institutions, museums, and universities that both required and legitimated the products of this endeavor, and the seemingly endless lists of material impedimenta: cameras, calipers, eye and skin color charts, survey forms and schedules required to systematize the gathering of this data, and finally the anthropologist himself, as a human instrument studying other human beings and their societies. Upon these technologies and instruments and techniques were built the modern endeavor to qualify and visualize difference, and it is from their use that the anthropologist as a gendered modern subject emerges during the ethnographic encounter. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book project. In my book project, Becoming Natives, I examined 5 different histories of fieldwork read against the history of anthropology and empire. In chapter 1, I talk about Albert and Maud Jenks in Bontoc, where they essentially imagine themselves as surrogate parents to a group of Bontoc Igorot boys, and from there arrive at an ethnographic narrative of these boys' coming of age. Chapter 2 is about a single man, a confirmed bachelor anthropologist, and a really queer figure, Frederick Starr, who encounters the category of the binabae, quite a difficult term to translate properly, and I'm trying to attempt in this chapter to understand Starr's attempts to comprehend the seemingly very local category of gender variance. In chapter 3, I write about Faye Cooper and Mabel Cook Cole, who were ritually adopted by the Tinggians, making them kin, and in the process the Coles imagined themselves as becoming natives, which is where I get the title of the book from. My 4th chapter, The Anthropologist as Anti-Hero, concerns William Jones, who is a part Native American anthropologist who fundamentally misunderstands idealizations of manhood among the Ilongots, who end up killing him for his particular misperformance of masculinity. And finally, chapter 5, where I talk about strange women in the field, and strange women in my book. So in the book, I argue that what matters is to consider how anthropologists made themselves legible to their indigenous subjects, and to derive, however blindly, how these subjects responded, since the basis of the ethnographic encounter is the particular mutuality between anthropologist and his interlocutors. I argue that within these encounters, anthropologists selectively employed the markers of gender that their own indigenous subjects held, based on how well or how poorly they understood these. These markers and their relevance to local culture. And then I then frame this against the way that the American colonial government in the Philippines subsumed the hierarchical and categorical logic of ethnology in its attempts to rationally and scientifically administer its new colony in the Philippines. It's also very much a Southeast Asia question. So part of the theoretical framework of the subject of the book are these 4 axioms, I call them, that cohere the study of sex and gender in Southeast Asia. The first, cognatic kinship. The second one, this idea of the high status of women. The third is the man of prowess. And the last, the tensions between gender pluralism and transgression. I'll talk about that in Q&A if you're interested, but this is just like the how the whole book interacts with the field of Southeast Asia. So today, as I mentioned, I draw from the final chapter of Becoming Natives, What Strange Woman Is Here, focusing on the gender dimensions of fieldwork conducted by Laura Benedict, no relation to Ruth, for 14 months between 1906 to 1908 among the Bagobos of Davao Gulf in Mindanao in the southern archipelago. In Benedict's published work, she weaves the voices of her Bagobo interlocutors into her ethnographic account, a feature of the genre not to become really popular until 50 years after her own work in Mindanao. The knowledge that she co-produced with her informants and interlocutors was, I argue, a new way of doing ethnography in the first decade of the 20th century, foreshadowing not only participant observation, only a little later will be codified as the disciplinary method, maybe 15 years after her work, but also was an early attempt at collaborative ethnography. What follows now is part of her story. You were the first trained woman to go into the field, Laura Benedict was reminded by Alfred Court Haddon in 1906 while she spent a week with the eminent British anthropologist at his home in Cambridge. You will break the way for other women. Perhaps, had her circumstances been different, Haddon's assessment would have proved prescient. Laura Benedict was not the first American woman to go into the field for ethnographic research, though she was the first one to do so across the Pacific. Unlike other American women who were restricted either by predilection or practicality to working among the Native American peoples of North America. Benedict was also the first with academic training in anthropology, receiving her MA from the University of Chicago in 1905. She was also the first American anthropologist to work in the Philippines without prior fieldwork experience among the Native American peoples. She likewise began her fieldwork in Mindanao before, for example, Margaret Mead in Samoa in 1925, Cora Dubois and Alor in the Dutch Indies in 1937, or even the putative father of participant observation, Malinowski in the Trobriands from 1914 to 1916. And yet in the assessment of her only biographer, Laura Benedict remains an enigma. Besides the 30-odd letters which George Dorsey, curator of anthropology at the Field Museum, and Benedict exchanged while she was in the field, she left no corpus of archival documents. Nor was she able to publish any other ethnography of the Bagobos beyond a brief article on their folklore in 1914, and her dissertation, published in 1916, which she completed under Franz Boas at Columbia. In her dissertation, a study of Bagobo ceremonial magic and myth, she weaves into her ethnography the voices of her interlocutors. They're not merely named, but they speak. She does not merely encounter them, but they too encounter her. They made claims upon Laura Benedict. They tried to make sense of her presence among them. And in the end, while recognizing her as not precisely one of them, they enfolded Laura Benedict within their social, cultural, and religious lives. She was not merely among the Bagobos as an observer, but as one who was invited by the people themselves to participate in their social life, and so through this she becomes acculturated into their life world. Of course, the Bagobo invitation came neither immediately nor easily. She was, after all, a strange woman among them, her presence provoking question not only from the people themselves, but from their anitos, the spirits whom they petitioned, pacified, or placated, the spirits who spoke and sang their wishes and complaints and demands through the Mabalyan, who were predominantly female ritual specialists past childbearing age and were weavers with great skill at the abaca looms. Benedict found among the Bagobo women and their society an enviable equitability between the sexes, which is explicitly to say not the fantasy of matriarchy via Bachofen or Westermarck. Rather, she admits that politically the Bagobos are not of the matriarchal type, for men are at the head, but that the status of women within their cultural world evinced a degree of complementarity that to us might later suggest the proverbial high status of women in Southeast Asia. She first became interested in the Bagobos when she encountered 38 of them who were performing in the Living Ethnological Exhibition at the St. Louis Fair in 1904. The Bagobos were billed at the fair as the handsomest peoples of the islands, whose men were tall, sinewy, and savage, and the women well-formed, graceful, and frequently very pretty. They were supposedly the most primitive and in all ways the most spectacular of the island peoples, not only for how they adorned their finely woven garments with beads and bells and shells, but also, more interestingly, because they offered human sacrifice as a cult rather than as a religion. Now, if anybody can explain what that means to me, the difference between a cult and a religion, I would love to hear it, because I've been thinking about this for so long and I cannot make sense of what they actually mean by this. Alongside the other Philippine peoples performing at the fair and discussed elsewhere in my book, the Bagobos were framed through the contemporary popular and scientific idiom of cultural evolutionism, representing a particular stage of development between the poles of primitivity and modernity. And yet cultural evolutionism was not the lens through which Benedict analyzed her fieldwork in the Philippines. Her dissertation makes no attempt to place the Bagobos or their practices and beliefs within an evolutionary matrix, though it remained ethnologically grounded in positing comparisons between the Bagobos of Mindanao and the Dayaks of Borneo, for example. But indeed, for its time, and considering the context of ethnology in the first decade of the 20th century, Laura Benedict's work is refreshingly free of both the language and theoretical assumptions of primitivity, savagery, or backwardness. In the fall of 1905, she approached George Dorsey, curator of anthropology at the Field Museum, as well as one of her instructors at the University of Chicago, to discuss her future plans. She intended to write a dissertation based on fieldwork among the Bagobos for a period of at least 2 years. While Dorsey wanted to support her research, he was unable to secure funding from the Field Museum to underwrite her trip at the outset. But in 1906, the $20,000 bequest given by the Illinois grain merchant Robert Fowler Cummings proved for Benedict and for the museum a stroke of luck. So Cummings gave this $20,000 gift to establish a collection of Philippine material at the Field Museum. While Benedict could not be directly employed by the museum, Dorsey offered her terms through which she could get to the Philippines and do her research. She was to become an independent collector of ethnological specimens among the Bagobos, which meant that she would receive neither salary, stipend, nor payment for expenses. Dorsey, however, promised to purchase the collection that she could put together, though it was not to be paid out to her until the objects that she collected eventually arrived in Chicago at the end of her collecting period. Before sailing to the Philippines in 1906, Benedict undertook preliminary research trips in museums in the US and in Europe. She met with anthropologists and curators in Philadelphia and New York, in Leiden and Cambridge and Berlin, and arrived in Mindanao in July 1906 at the age of 45. She began with a few weeks' work as a school teacher in Davao to augment her meager funds and to begin learning the language. She eventually settled on her field site of Santa Cruz, a predominantly Bagobo settlement down the coast, later that October. After she arrived, she realized that the more time she spent in the field, the more she became convinced that she could spend a lifetime there. The longer she stayed in Mindanao and the more her collection of Bagobo material culture grew, the more she came to understand the meanings that the Bagobos placed upon their things. The more she was convinced that all she had made, as she said, was a mere beginning. Her letters and her work demonstrate a great ethnographic humility in the face of the utter complexity of the other's life world. She remained in Davao District until early 1908. Her field work of a little over a year left her health, both physical and mental, in shreds. Apparently, she suffered a nervous breakdown, which has usually been interpreted as caused by her increasing paranoia towards the American hemp planters in the district. She believed that these planters were causing nothing less than the spoliation of the natural life of the Bagobos, not just by little steps, but by great upheavals in rapid succession. Her paranoia, I will argue, was born out of her acculturation into the Bagobo world and her deep engagement and intimacy with her interlocutors, who were facing the extension of the American plantation economy and its demands on indigenous labor as a severe crisis in their tribal history. Benedict was finally forced to leave the Philippines in 1908 under the charge of her sister, who took the Trans-Pacific steamer to rescue her from a hospital in Manila. She was never to return to the Philippines. After first recuperating in California for several months, she returned to Chicago in early 1909 with great need for Dorsey to make good on his promise of buying her collection, but he reneged on their agreement. The only money ever paid out by the Field Museum to Benedict was for the sale of a Bagobo skull for $5, incidentally one that belonged to a young woman and thus did not possess the value it would were it an adult male. Her Bagobo material culture collection was eventually purchased by the American Museum of Natural History in New York in 1910 for $4,000. Undeterred by her experiences in the field, she applied and was admitted to the Department of Anthropology at Columbia, where she finished her dissertation in 1914. We know little of her life after the PhD. We do know that she was unable to secure a permanent appointment as an anthropologist, either at museums or universities, and spent the remainder of her professional career in temporary lectureships. She died at the age of 71 in December 1932 in Philadelphia. It is impossible to hear the outlines of Laura Benedict's story without being struck by a sense of tragedy, of the seemingly insuperable difficulties that she faced as a woman in a field that was beginning to professionalize, as a single woman conducting fieldwork without institutional or familial financial support, and as a trained and credentialed anthropologist in her own right, finding it impossible to secure an academic appointment. And yet, focusing on the tragic aspects of her story renders her pioneering work in the Philippines futile when it was not. That she struggled through fieldwork she admitted to Dorsey quite freely, but at the same time she was convinced that there was no other place for her but the field, no other research that she would want to do than to study and to continue learning more about the Bagobos, and that no other work would satisfy her except that of the work of anthropology. And it is thus to her work in the field that we turn. The coastal settlement of Santa Cruz, where Benedict spent most of her time, was founded in the late 19th century to concentrate Bagobos in one location for both missionary work and to make use of their labor. Her house in Santa Cruz was located on the main road, and the road which leads to the cockpit, which was useful for her collection for the ease of acquiring objects from the Bagobo who loses at the cockfight or gets hard up otherwise. She could not afford profligacy in buying specimens, but had to purchase items carefully, somewhat slowly but steadily, studying various possibilities of purchase and prices, and the various ways in which sorts of barter and cash stimulations affect different natives on different occasions. By necessity, she had to be methodical and discerning. Large and visually striking specimens were beyond her means. Instead, she collected the textiles with the most elaborate patterns, no less precious even while small. She arguably was able to make them more valuable, for alongside these objects, she collected the stories of the people who made them, the names and the myths of the gods and the spirits who oversaw their creation, and the histories of their use. These objects were sold to Benedict not simply because she offered to buy them. They were sold to her because of who she was and because of how the Bagobos understood her within their social matrix. She was not merely collecting interesting specimens without context, precisely the things that she wished to avoid sending Dorsey, because she understood that the objects by themselves would be insufficient. She was collecting material culture, where objects were simultaneously materiality and meaning, illustrative of how the Bagobos manufactured and used them, of the social relations that produced these objects, and of their ritual utility. The object in material culture, after all, is demonstrative of the social and cultural processes of their creation and exchange. She, by necessity, had to discover the relative value of objects to the Bagobos, a task that required a great deal of time. There is no such thing as rushing through in 3 or 4 months and sweeping up their things into a collection, as doing so would result in no more insightful a study given the complexity of meanings attached to cultural objects, which she had to coax out of her informants over long periods of time. Benedict's method hinged on a sense of reciprocity. They have spent weeks and months in making them, and like a mother her children, they love and cherish their things. Benedict's reciprocal approach is made most apparent in how she herself struggled to understand why the Bagobos love and cherish their things. She spent weeks and months fostering close relationships with the women who were interlocutors, watching, for example, the weavers Hebe and Odal at the looms, helping them with stretching out the hemp fibers or preparing bundles for the dye vats. And so, through this process, helping Benedict herself disentangle the meanings that accrued to Bagobo material culture, discovering which spirits had charge over their creation, and the social roles which the object's makers played in their communities. For Benedict, these Bagobo things were not merely exotic objects that may be beautifully or artistically made, but carry culture and meaning. It was her coming to understand precisely what their meanings were for the Bagobos was what she herself precisely wanted to let them understand, of how she herself has come to value the objects, not just as a mere collector who comes to sweep them up, but as one who has come to feel as the Bagobos felt about their work. Among my anthropologists in the book, only Benedict evinces a sensitivity to the process of creating material culture, of the meaning of indigenous labor, and the feelings the Bagobos harbored over the works of their hands. Her collecting praxis appears to move beyond the strictly transactional nature of buying specimens or having them made, but instead aimed to likewise recognize the effort that has gone into their creation. The human labor, too, were parts of the culture of material culture. Not merely the how and what for of the objects and their manufacture, but the why of their making. A deeper motivation undergirds her sympathetic praxis, one that I think is clear in the catalog and notes that she prepared for the sale of her collection to the American Museum in 1910. The specimen cards that she prepared for the sale are replete with contextual information, in many cases not only noting how the objects were made, but also who made them, who owned them, how they were used, and how she acquired them. Her textile collections are indicative of this motivation. For instance, this umpak kamama, or a man's bright, showy jacket of fine checked hemp, woven from red-dyed abaca and heavily beaded all over, but upon whose back is the large figure of Nawa, wife of Uda, the owner of the jacket, and the woman who wove and decorated and sold the umpak herself. A second object I think is more intimately related with Benedict. It was a tangkulu, which was a warrior's kerchief that indicated a man's status as magani, as a man of prowess, who had slain others and, according to Benedict, given the war god blood to drink. And so it's a signal of status among men. She writes in the specimen card, "It was of special value because it belonged to old Kapitan Oleng, chief datu of the country round about Talun. This tangkulu was last worn by the aged datu on August 11th, 1907, when he took it off his head and gave it to me in trade. A few months later, he died. Kapitan Oleng was a man of charming personality and refinement." Taking the objects merely as specimens, the umpak and the tangkulu that I've showed you didn't require the contextual information that Benedict provided in the specimen cards. And yet by doing so, she ensured that the histories of those objects, not merely their provenance or the process of their manufacture, would remain as viable and valuable sources of cultural information, in turn ensuring the cultural worth and meaning that these objects have would remain even while they are taken away from their original context. Beyond her immense ethnographic sensitivity as regards to material culture, I also wish to focus on accounts of her fieldwork, whose most intensive phase occurred in the district of Talun, which lay along the foothills of Mount Apo, 2 days' journey uphill from the coast. So first on horseback and then on foot, Benedict arrived there on July 25th, 1907, and spent the next 4 weeks as a guest of Datu Oleng in the village of Mati. She writes, I was the first white woman the people had ever seen. So this is a gendered claim about the ethnographic encounter, and her claim goes, that while the Bagobos may have been familiar with white men and their positions in colonial society as soldiers or as explorers or as missionaries, white women were as a category set apart. It assumes that the Bagobos could not directly draw upon a cultural or social repertoire of dealing with white women in the same way that they knew how to deal with white men. What Benedict does with the claim is interesting, as not only was she the first woman to get up there, she was also doing things that the men were not interested in doing. For she claims that prior to her, no white person, it is to be presumed, had ever before inspected the Bagobo ceremonies, that nobody before had watched their processes of work and written them down, that no outsider had ever followed into the little processions in the moonlight to the wayside shrines and crouched on the ground with the old women as they made their invocations of the buso and the gods. It's a doubled claim. Here was a tribe that nobody had studied before, and that she is doing something different from all the others for the sake of ethnological science. It is a claim for experience, of not only being there, but also of doing as the natives are doing to better convey and interpret their culture for an outside audience. It is participant observation before the fact. Benedict was not merely the observer, seeing, but rendering themselves unseen. Because her language is active and participatory, she does not merely observe the processes and processions, she herself was processing with the Bagobo women who were offering to placate the spirits and was crouching literally upon the ground as these spirits were invoked. The Bagobos of Talun were celebrating the Ginum, the most important of their ceremonies, according to her. Despite arriving as a guest of their Datu, Benedict was aware of how suspiciously she was initially held by the Bagobos. The Bagobos wanted to know whether she was spying for the colonial government, who sought to eradicate practices it deemed uncivilized, polygamy, intertribal warfare, human sacrifice. The Bagobos anxiously wanted to know why this strange woman was so interested in them. They asked her these questions directly. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard like a fire alarm. They asked her these questions directly and she answered them directly, more or less. But the Bagobos' response to their dialogic encounter was rendered back to Benedict polyvocally and indirectly. That is, from the Anitos, the spirits who spoke and sang their wishes and demands through the Mabalyan. Benedict describes a series of manganito which she glosses as seances or oracles. She writes, "The gods would come at night when all the torches had been extinguished and sing about me through the mouth of the medicine woman. The first Anito to speak on Benedict's behalf was not Bagobo, though they were speaking through the medium whose name was Singan, the Mabalyan who went into trance and delivered the spirit's song and speech. This Anito spoke as follows: I am the spirit of the Senora, that is Benedict herself, and I love the Bagobo. While Benedict had no speaking parts to play in the Manganito, her own spirit did, and they expressed Benedict's position plainly to the Bagobos in attendance. Her scientific endeavor was one that was dialogically transformed into a labor of love. She was there among them to learn from them because, at least according to her American but Bagobo-speaking spirit, Benedict loved the Bagobos. Whether this was an interpolation of the statements she already made to them prior to the fact is difficult to ascertain, though it was spoken not by Benedict herself, but through the double mediation of her spirit and the spirit medium. Benedict's Bagobo-speaking spirit spoke no more through the medium after this one line, for the culture hero, the mighty one of the headwaters, spoke next. He reassured them that he was friends with the Americans and that he favored the American presence in Mindanao and that the Bagobo should not be afraid of Benedict because she was American and that they were his friends. This was their culture hero, the mighty one of the headwaters. Benedict found her experience of the Manganito all weird and a little exciting, but more importantly, she realized that her social standing and scientific success depended largely upon what the spirits said about her in the night, which usually meant the last impression left upon the mind of the medicine woman before she went into trance. And that this medium was under the perpetual influence, if not the complete control, of Datu Oleng's sister, the oldest woman in the family, a strong, capable, self-sufficient, and really admirable woman. This woman, Mianda, from where I get the title of the talk from, it's Mianda who responds to the Anito saying, when the Anito asks, what strange woman is here, can we make her sick? It is Mianda who responds to the Anito and to the spirits of the disease. But Mianda makes all the pots, all the beautiful black and red dyes, works every minute at the hardest labor, yet never loses a certain grand dignity of bearing that distinguished her as the leading woman. Benedict helped Mianda in the hardest part of the work, in the process of pottery making, by pounding earth for the clay vessels for nearly an hour, labor which was extremely hard for her in her old age, even with her splendid physique. In the process of helping Mianda make the pots destined to be offered to the spirits at the Ginum, Benedict learns not just about Bagobo pottery, but the meanings they attach to their manufacture and their offertory value. It is by participating in the creation that Benedict acquires ethnographic knowledge and simultaneously establishes a relationship with Mianda. If Benedict took pictures of this old woman, her primary informant, they haven't survived. What we do have is this piece of textile that she wove and likely sold to Benedict at Talun in 1907. From the beginning of her time at Talun, Benedict trained her eyes on Mianda and on the Mabalyan and the other women. When these women disappeared from the scene, that was her signal to nonchalantly wend her way through the crowd to follow along. Benedict writes of how Mianda and the other women taught her how to make awas, offerings of areca leaf and betel nut to certain spirits, both malevolent and benign. And Mianda and the other women allowed her to accompany them as they processed to the wayward shrines where these offerings were laid. As I said earlier, she knelt upon the ground, Benedict knelt upon the ground like they all did. And while she did not know the words to the prayers and the devotions, it was clear that the Bagobos did not merely suffer her presence. She writes, "The kindly spirit that these conservative old people showed in permitting a woman of another race, a new acquaintance, to take part in this private ceremony was emphasized by many a little token of friendliness. They would take my hand as I knelt beside them, ask me if it were not all very good, and once Ikda put her arms around me and asked if people performed rites like this in America and what I would do when I had learned all the Bagobo ceremonies and other customs." In the weeks preceding the Ginum, the 4 days of its celebration, and the week subsequent, Benedict makes clear that she did not merely observe the ceremonials and their preparation, but was invited by her Bagobo hosts to participate in almost all of its aspects. On the second day of the Ginum, for example, during the ritual ablution in the river, Dato Ido, Oleng's son and Mianda's nephew, pointed Benedict out from the crowd watching from the riverbank. He told her to loosen her hair, for it was her turn to immerse herself in the waters, thus perhaps recognizing her as a sharer in the benefits of the Ginum and as one of themselves rather than as a mere spectator. There seems no reason for the Bagobos to include her in this ceremony, and not all Bagobos at the riverbank were asked to purify themselves. Her suspicion that it was at this moment that she ceased to be a mere spectator seems to be founded. On the final day of the communal feast concluding the Ginum, she observes that 8 large plates of heavy white crockery were prepared with special attention, for they were to be served to the 8 most distinguished guests at the Ginum. And again, to her surprise, she turned out to be one of the honored 8, the other 7 being Datu and other Bagobo of note. No reason was given to her for this distinction. It was given to her seemingly without question, either on her part or on the part of her hosts. What is clear, however, was that it was proffered as a signal of her status as an honored guest. In August 1907, after her month at the Ginum, she returned to her house in Santa Cruz, exhausted. For all of the pleasures of being in the field, the extent of the clarity and insight it provided, the knowledge she acquired, and the relationships she had formed, she was glad to be back upon more familiar territory, where she possessed some semblance of comfort. She found herself blissfully happy over such things, chief of which was the fact that she was again able to go in and out of her house freely without a chorus of voices calling out, "Where are you going?" and "Where have you been?" Benedict's letters after her time in Talun makes clear that she felt a disorientation and strangeness common enough when doing field work. And she hoped the time back in more familiar, less ethnographically taxing surroundings would ease these feelings. They did not, and though she did not know it yet, her return to Santa Cruz only signaled the beginning of the end. The end of Laura Benedict's 14 months fieldwork was a time of great personal upheaval. In November 1907, several months after returning from the Ginum at Talun, she had finally reached the end of her financial resources, meager as they were to begin with. Her funds had dwindled to almost nothing, and in order to continue to survive, she had to sell her return ticket to the United States. And yet she remained pressed to continue to pay for her subsistence and to continue to buy material culture as she came across it. In addition to her state of extreme financial precarity, she was also burdened by illness in the field and, as she writes, an unexpected lot of cares and obstacles that she bravely, though perhaps unwisely, believed would do no good to write about. She was burdened by the fear that what she had devoted her time, her resources, and indeed her very self to in the field would come to naught because of changes in Davao outside of her control. That is, the hemp planters. Doubt set in. The end of Laura Benedict's time in Davao District was also a time of great upheaval for the Bagobos, a moment of severe tribal crisis in their tribal history, as Benedict sensed. She was not merely a witness to this crisis, but a participant in it. As much as she might have decried the great upheavals in rapid succession caused by the need of American planters for labor in their hemp fields, as much as she might have distanced herself from the American military occupation of Davao in relating with her Bagobo interlocutors, she too was part of these events. She despaired that Talun, with its wonderful and picturesque life, will soon be dead, and that the disintegration of the whole body of Bagobo custom and Bagobo tradition cannot long be held off. Her despair is the anthropologist's despair of the colonial context, one rooted in the desire to preserve traditional indigenous culture, yes, but one that is more insidiously a desire to keep the natives as they were, to keep them immobile and unmoved by the currents of politics and the economy and of culture outside of their own. The logic of American anthropology of Benedict's era, and she is an anthropologist of her own era, is very difficult to countervail, despite her sympathy and despite her acculturation. While she was no agent of the colonial state and had indeed despised its military and economic expansion as antithetical to scientific research, she could no more escape it than her interlocutors could. The abrupt end of her fieldwork among the Bagobos in Davao has been couched by latter-day scholars as a tragedy born out of her increasing paranoia from early 1907 onwards. The narrative of her mental and physical breakdown is simple, at least according to Faye Cooper Cole, one of her colleagues at the Field Museum, whose report of Miss Benedict's venture 2 years after the fact has been taken as the definitive account of her final months in the field. According to Cole, Benedict proceeded at once to overdo and at the same time starve herself in order to devote all her energies to the work. In order to devote all her energies to the work, she cut herself away from the other Americans and lived in a little hut by herself. In a few months, she had ruined her health, and her mind could not stand the strain. She believed that the planters were trying to raise prices on her. Later, they tried to steal her collection. And finally, she believed that the planters had designs on her life. And now this is Cole interjecting. Cole says, "The people she most feared are the best people of the district, and there seems to have been not the slightest ground for her suspicion." Perhaps a critique of Cole's account is unnecessary here, for we know already that it is contextually accurate. That she outdid herself and starved herself in the interests of her collection is obvious enough, but it's also obvious enough because the Field Museum never paid her anything to do this research. That she decided to eschew the society of the Americans and other white people in Davao was also the case. Her assiduousness in focusing almost exclusively on her work among the Bagobos led her to neglect the equally important extra-ethnographic work of maintaining relationships with the white world immediately closest to her. And yet we lose something when we merely concur with Cole that this was the result of how she proceeded at once to overdo and starve herself. Was it paranoia? Perhaps. But this paranoia came as a response to her situation in Mindanao among the Bagobos. My point in re-examining what she herself has said about her fieldwork and her situation is not to ascertain whether she did suffer for paranoia or even to analyze the consequences of it, but to try to understand how she might have gotten to this sense of paranoia in the first place. Her convictions did not come from nowhere, and while it might have come across to an unsympathetic audience as paranoia, there are ways of explaining it that are responsive to the context of her ethnographic encounters in Mindanao. Her paranoia, however accurate that term might be, was a response arising from her participation and observation of a kind of Bagobo life that she feared would be gone forever. It ought not be dismissed as the ravings made by a mind, according to Cole, that could not stand the strain. It is fruitless to attempt to psychologize her mental break, and we can only fall back on what she said about her experiences. She had lived among the Bagobos of Santa Cruz. She had participated in the rituals of the Ginum in Talun as an honored guest of their datu. She had taught their children as a school teacher. She hung their crab shell charms against the malevolent buso above her door. But she was also an anthropologist of her time. And in the vein of liberal anthropological projects of cultural preservation, she was devastated by the encroachment of the plantation economy and what that spelled for the supposed end of Bagobo culture. Her paranoia, if that was what that was born of the situation she observed and of which she was part. That the culture which she had put so much time into studying, a people whose language and mode of thought she labored to learn, these same people, her friends, who gave her freely stories, magical devices, as well as explanations of ceremonies, people who entertained her at their homes, who excused her blunders, and who helped her in 100 ways, whose beliefs she had come to understand and to believe in herself, she thought that they were all about to disappear. It was precisely her method of participant observation that allowed her to come closest to Bagobo ways of life and modes of thought. It is this very same enmeshedness and reciprocality, the ideal type of ethnographic fieldwork that she practiced before its articulation and canonization as the disciplinary method, that led Laura Benedict to be suspicious towards the planters and the cultural destruction that they represented. Did Laura Benedict identify more with the Bagobos than with the other Americans in Davao? Undoubtedly. Did the stress and privation and uncertainty of her unfunded research take a toll on her mind and her body? Undoubtedly. But to these, we must also add that her sincerely held belief of the prospect of the disintegration of Bagobo culture would have placed another layer upon the burdens of the mind. We may dismiss this last as speculation, but because of what we know of what she did among the Bagobos, how enamored she was of their culture, how deeply and mutually she was drawn into their cultural life, the very same culture that she, however partially, became acculturated to, then it is unlikely that she would have faced what she believed to be the disintegration of Bagobo culture quite paradoxically, the Bagobos' own acculturation with equanimity. Thank you.